Hi, I'm Tom Stockman. I'm a string repair technician with Music and Arts. I've been working professionally as a string repair tech for 29 years. So the content for my presentation today is to give you a little better understanding of the orchestral instruments that you have in your classrooms, hopefully give you some tips on care and handling for your instruments, and finally maybe some simple things and problems that you can address in the classroom and some simple fixes. The first part of this presentation I like to refer to as a pound of prevention. Musical instruments, and particularly string instruments, are very much a living thing. And what I mean by that is, even though the tree may have been felled hundreds of years ago, the wood that is in the instrument still has the ability to take in and give off moisture. It's very susceptible to changes in humidity and changes in temperature. Simple guideline for the storage and care of your instrument is your instrument's going to be happy in the same kind of environment that we are. Generally, 65 to 75 degrees, 45 to 55% relative humidity. Those are ideal conditions to store and keep your instruments in. Not always going to be practical in a classroom setting or in a transportation setting, but the biggest thing you want to try to avoid in handling your instruments are extreme changes in temperature. So for instance, if your instruments are stored in the luggage area of the bus on the way to a performance, it's in the middle of the cold season, give your instruments a bit of time to acclimate when you bring them back in before you open up the cases. Typically, just touching the outside of the case when it's a little bit warm to the touch, that's when you're going to be safe to go. So an extra important step, so a lot of damage that can be done to these instruments by extreme changes in temperature. A couple things to look for that are telltale signs of humidity if you have symptoms. So the biggest thing you're going to see is changes in string height, changes in ways that the peg function. For fretted instruments, first thing you're going to notice is the frets on the edge of the fingerboard are going to seem a little bit long because the width of the wood along the fingerboard starts to shrink up in that low humidity. So we're here in the Northeast. It's not uncommon for January, February, when the heat is running, for that relative humidity percentage to get down in 10-15% range. That can be really, really dangerous to your instrument. So number of products that are available on the market that you can use, dampits, different humidifiers. Some have the ability to maintain humidity within the case. So in the band room, if you can run a humidifier or have a storage closet, that's a great place to try to control humidity. The absolute best thing is to store the instruments in the cases when you're not using them. So it allows you to have a very small environment to be able to control that and help to protect your instruments from those effects. So very important thing. I put a lot of emphasis on awareness with this through our repair shops and in our clinics because it can have a huge impact on how you maintain your fleet and the usefulness of it. So observing those simple guidelines of trying to keep the instruments in the same climate that we're comfortable in is going to go a long way to help maintaining not only the longevity of the instrument, but being able to keep it in your classroom and in your program and not need any repairs. In some cases, repairs can be extreme. In some cases, not even possible with the level of damage that an instrument can encounter with low humidity. So just simple, important guidelines to help follow. I include this in every clinic just to help show a lot of awareness. We see a lot of humidity-related issues come through our shops in the winter months, and this is just some simple things that you can do in the classroom to help prevent that and help prolong the life of the fleet and keep your students playing. Some of the most common problems that we see for instruments that come into our shops are peg problems. So the two most biggest thing you're going to see with peg issues are slipping and sticking. So there can be commonalities with what makes both of these instances occur. But what I wanted to walk you through are some simple ways to diagnose some of that. Also show you a couple different types of tuning pegs that you may encounter with some of the instruments you have in the classroom. So the first one we have here is this is just a conventional friction peg. Very common what you're going to see on most of your violins, violas, cellos. So this peg, it creates the tension in place by contacting the two walls of the peg box here where it passes through. The peg is fit to a very specific taper. So in this case, it's a 1 to 30 ratio. That has to be matched very carefully to the size of that peg box for that peg to be able to function and turn and hold the way it needs to. Before we get into kind of diagnosing the peg, a couple things that we want to look for with the instrument itself is we want to look closely and see if there are any kind of fractures or breaks at any point in the peg box. Because of the friction fit and the taper of these pegs, they have a wedging action towards the peg box that they're placed in. If there's any cracks, that wedging action is going to make those cracks worse and not only cause more structural damage to the instrument, but it's going to prevent that peg from working. So up here in the A peg in a violin, that's very common because that's where the peg box is going to be the thinnest. Not completely uncommon to see sometimes here at the heel as well. So that's something you always want to check first with any kind of peg diagnosis, is any sort of significant structural damage. Next thing we want to do is we want to check the fit of the peg. So to do that, just going to take a little bit of the tension off the peg. And I'm just going to give it a little bit of lateral movement to see if there's any kind of movement between those two surfaces that's going to indicate that we don't have a fit. So if you've got a good fit, the next steps I'll show you is a really simple remedy that will help to fix that, whether it is slipping or sticking. If you don't have a fit, chances are very good the best remedy is going to be to get it to a shop so that we can have a technician either reshape that peg and get it back to round or refit a new peg inside of that hole. So I'm going to go ahead and back this peg out. So what you'll see are the two contact surfaces of where the peg impacts the inside of the peg box. And you can see they're kind of shiny, so showing a lot of wear and a lot of compression. So a simple remedy that you can do for this is just a piece of 220 wet or dry sandpaper. Just take and hold it around the peg, line up to the surface of where the contact is. Just give it a couple turns, nothing too aggressive. We're just trying to get a little bit of that glaze off, so now it's got more of a matte finish and not that shininess. So, little dab of peg compound, lots of different varieties of this. This happens to be the Hill compound that we like to use in the shop. So, a little bit of compound on both of those surfaces. You don't need to do the whole length of the peg under the string and all the way out. Just sparingly on those two surfaces is all you need. Go ahead and put that back into the peg box. And now we've got a good clean surface with that peg. Another thing that you will see that can cause slipping problems for pegs is where the string hole passes through the peg box. As these pegs wear, they tend to go towards the center of the peg box. So what you'll see in a lot of cases, the hole that the string passes through will make its way out here and wedge up against the other side of the peg box. That's going to keep that peg from going in and getting that wedging action that it needs to hold. That's another important thing. If you have a good fit and you have a clean peg, that's something else you want to look for, is that string is not impacting that and pushing it back out. Relatively simple fix in our shops. We use a 1/16 of an inch drill bit. We just drill another peg. If you feel comfortable with doing that yourself, something that is important, if you drill a new hole, drill it perpendicular to the existing hole. So if you drill it on the same angle, you're going to split the peg in half most likely. So just an important thing with that, to do it at a 90-degree angle if you choose to take that on. So another thing that we see that contributes to tuning issues and peg issues is how the strings are installed in the pegs. So what we like to do, and what I always advise, is I wrap one time to the inside, and then we start wrapping to the outside. And you want to finish up to the outside of the peg box. So what I mean by that is to the point closest to the button in the large side of the peg. So reason for that action helps to draw the peg into the peg box, and it also promotes for the string to pull straight over top of the nut slot. So not only going to prevent any kind of tuning problems by trying to pull the string, at more of an angle, also helps to prevent any kind of string breakage problems or things like that. So also useful stuff that you can use on fretted instruments as well with the winding. You always want to wind to the outside or wind down. These have about 3 or 4 wraps around them. That's usually about the maximum that you need. Strings come gauged to different scale lengths and lengths of the violin. The most important thing to help prevent is you don't want to have a lot of excess string wadded up around the peg that could impact anything turning freely from that. If you have a sticking peg, chances are pretty good the sandpaper is going to be the same remedy. Another product that is available that you can use is called peg drops. So peg drops are kind of the opposite of the peg compound that we see. And where this is to promote slipping, this is to stop slipping. This is something that you can use in an emergency situation if you have a peg that's a bit out of shape or out of fit to help get you by in a performance. What I do recommend with this is when you apply it to the peg is put a drop on the peg, maybe spread around with a Q-tip or something like that. Let it dry and then put it back in the peg box. So one of the big mistakes we see with the use of this product is we put a drop of the solvent on the peg, goes straight into the peg box, it glues it into position in one place. It will usually always turn, but it'll turn smoothly and then it'll only stick in that one place. And chances are usually that's not where it's in tune. So that's why I always try to suggest to put it on the peg first, let it dry, and then put it back in the peg box. Another place this product is really useful is on cellos and basses, a lot of which some you'll run across to have the really smooth and shiny finishes on the top. A little drop of this on the bottom of the bridge feet also goes a long way to help promote, to keep that from sliding around. So again, let it dry completely so you're not running into any issue with the solvent, maybe reacting with the finish. But that's also another way to use this. This is commercially available. You can make your own in the classroom, a little bit of rubbing alcohol, some ground up rosin dissolved inside of it. A lot of uses for that and then you get into a pinch. So wanted to show you a couple other different types of tuning pegs so that you may encounter. So the first of these is a Planetary geared peg. These are sold, the brand name that's most prevalent that you see is Perfection. And the way these are designed is there's a gear in the center, the sun gear, and then around that is the ring gear that goes around it, hence the name the Planetary gear. What this does is the peg is fixed into the peg box, and when you turn the button, and this one's pretty stiff, when you turn the button, it moves the shaft through a geared reduction. A little different situation than what we had with the friction peg where the entire peg is turning, where this, the body of the peg is in position and just the button and this part where the string is affixed, it's turning. So not really any user serviceable parts inside of these that you can take them apart. A couple things to notice if you have some of these in your fleet and you're experiencing tuning problems is look to see if this entire mechanism here is also turning with the button. So that's a sign that it's come loose in the peg box. That's going to be something that would be best to get into a shop to have them resecure that, use a little drop of glue to get that in place. Another thing you can do with this mechanism is by putting some inward pressure, hopefully you can kind of see that on the camera, how that peg compresses in. By putting that inward pressure, you can load the tension onto that peg to make it a little harder to turn. If you needed to do string changes, turn these quickly, just back them out. It becomes very easy at that point. But as you tune, and same kind of motion that you'd want to do with the friction pegs, is to put a little bit of inward pressure on that as you turn. That helps load up the gears. One of the things that is really great about these is seldom do you need to have secondary fine tuners at the tailpieces, but we do see these in some of our markets and some of our school fleets that we work with, so you may encounter those. The other type of peg, these are no longer in production, but we still come across quite a few of them, sometimes in school fleets, and we even have a few left over in our rental fleet. This is the brand name is the Caspari peg. So this peg operates on a different principle. The fiber bushing that you see here is glued into the peg box. Essentially at that point, two halves of the peg. So everything here where the string hole is that extends into the peg box, and then the button and the mechanism here. If you encounter these and encounter problems with them, 90% of the issues that we see can be solved with just adjusting this tensioning screw. So just a thin flat blade screwdriver, just load a little bit of clockwise tension onto that screw. That helps draw these two halves together to counteract that string tension. It's going to solve a lot of issues. One of the things that's really important with these to help diagnose is when you're turning them is to really pay close attention to see what's turning and what isn't. And what I mean by that is under normal function, this fiber bushing should stay static and only the peg itself should be turning. So if you look closely and you have one you have problems with, if this fiber bushing is turning, that's going to need to be pulled back out and reset with some glue. That's something I would recommend you have a shop do. It can be kind of tricky. An over application of glue can end up with the peg just being one fixed point. At that point, it's a pretty difficult repair to remove all of that and drill the peg back out and start over. So that's not something I suggest that you try. But if you do encounter these, like I said, most of the time, what will help correct is going to be tightening that tension screw at the end. The final thing that we're going to encounter, and this is a tuning machine off of an upright bass. So you'll see lots of varieties of these. Sometimes they're mounted to a plate. Sometimes they're individual. There's different levels of ornamentation, things like that. All of these operate on the same principle. You have the post with the button. There's a worm gear here, and then just a circular gear there. So when this is turned, there's a reduction in that turns the post and turns the string. So not a lot that can go wrong with these. Something that's a good point of periodic maintenance is maybe just a simple drop of oil at these points. So if you've got valve oil in the band room, or maybe even a little bit of WD-40, something like that, periodically. Another good thing you can do is just to check this mounting screw that holds the gear in every once in a while. Doesn't have to be really, really tight. And actually, if it's too tight, it can make all this bind up, but just enough so that it's snug. There's a lot of varieties of sizes of the cap, a lot of varieties of screw pitch, thread, all of those things that can make these really challenging to replace if they get lost. So that's why I kind of put that in there as just a bit of little periodic maintenance to keep these from running away. Other things with this design, mounting screws here, that's something to be checked as well. But other than a little bit of oil and just keeping an eye on that post, not really a lot to go wrong with that you could service in the classroom. Most of these can be disassembled to an extent. Parts can be replaced. That's stuff we can help with if you had one that didn't want to cooperate. Another thing that we do see on upright basses that come in is we'll get complaints of buzzing or rattling coming from the instrument. What can happen is this button is affixed inside of this shaft and usually crimped down together. There can be just a little enough of play here that while you're playing, the open buttons are going to rattle just enough with the vibrations of the instrument being carried to the furthest points. Couple remedies for that. You can crimp them just a little bit with a pair of pliers. So try to use a smooth set of tooth pliers so you're not, putting big dents or gash marks in these. Other option that we have used in the shop is just a tiny drop of super glue that'll run down in the joint, create just enough wedge so those won't sizzle. But that's something we see quite a bit. Easy way to diagnose that, if the instrument's buzzing while you're playing it, get someone just to put their hands across the back of the peg box, put them on those buttons. That's your dead giveaway when you put that pressure on there if it stops singing. So that's some of the most common things you're going to encounter with tuning pegs. Again, if there's things that you're not sure of, please send it to your local shop. Most time we can diagnose these relatively easy. It does take some specialized tools to get into the fitting and replacement. So that's why we're a bit hesitant to send replacement pegs out, because of those tolerances like we talked about. So we're going to move right down the length of the instrument and focus on the bridge and the sound post. So first thing I like to discuss in relation to the bridge is the proper placement of the bridge on the instrument. So every instrument is going to be built to its own proportion. There are commonly accepted scales, but something that's going to be very important is to use the guidance of these notches on the F-holes. So the top of the bridge, or the cap where the strings pass across, should be centered to within these notches. So that's going to make sure that you've got the string length at the correct length, so that the intonation, if you've got any position markers or tape, anything like that, is going to make sure that that's in place. Another thing that's very important with the bridge and will help maintain the life of your bridge is over time and over use as the instrument is played, generally the strings always go slack and the instrument goes flat rather than sharp. And has a tendency, as we continue to tune, with tightening those strings, it tends to pull the bridge forward. So something that's a good matter of maintenance, in fact, is periodically just check that bridge and make sure that the feet are fully seated against the top. So they should be all the way back and contacting. So it's just as simple as grabbing the corners of the bridge, just moving it a little bit to where you get that firm fit. If it's a well-fitted bridge with flat feet, you're definitely going to feel it where it kind of clicks into that place. So the bridges that we do on our rental fleet and that we fit in our shops, generally we put at just a slight backward angle. So that helps counteract over time with that bridge pull forward. We found that that adds a lot of life to the bridge. So a lot of belief in the string industry that it needs to be 90 degrees. We can certainly do that, but that's one of the reasons we set ours up a little bit different. So the other thing that is important with placement is it's also going to affect the height of the strings. So if the bridge is too far forward, that angle and that geometry is going to make the string height a lot higher. If it's too far back, it's going to make it a lot lower. So that's always something to look at when you have an instrument that string height is changed or something like that. Always make sure that bridge is in position. So if you have a bridge that has fallen down, I'm going to go ahead and take this one out of position. The easy way to put it back in, and what I recommend, is loosen the strings just a bit so that you can get all the notches lined up. Use the tension of those strings to work with you. Plant the feet in position. Keep your thumbs low on the bridge, and then just pivot it back and have it stand up in a position. So then you can go ahead and tune it from there. If you have string protectors, we always like to promote definitely on the E string on violins, because you've got the plain core, sometimes on A's. Different schools of thought on this. I tend to put them right up here with the front of the bridge. That way there's nothing hanging past it that could vibrate or anything like that. And then again, just at the final part, just a little bit of plant to make sure the feet are seated. With alignment with the notches, we're looking for relative straight to the entire instrument. That can be a little bit tricky sometimes because you may have the end of the fingerboard or something that hasn't quite been cut parallel. The other thing that we want to look for when we center the bridge is we want to see that it's centered down the length of the fingerboard. There should be about the same amount on either side with that bridge placement. So a couple things to look for with that. So when we get the bridges in the shop that we fit, we receive them looking like this. So this is a blank. The cap is oversized. The feet have not been cut at all. So as a result, typically I'm pretty apprehensive with sending these out because it does take some training and some skill to get this properly fitted to the top of the instrument. So here's an example of one that has been cut and fitted, and you can kind of see the difference between the two. These have to be fitted individually to the top of the instrument, and then the height of this is adjusted in line with the projection and how far off the fingerboard is off the top. All that geometry comes into play. So it very seldom are these bridges interchangeable with instruments. So in our introduction, we talked about humidity and the changes of the instrument. It's very common for a symphony level player, someone has a higher end instrument, to have a winter and summer bridge, and then also a winter and summer sound post, because the instrument can move that much. Moving on to the inside of the instrument with the sound post, I will not do a reset in the video. What I would strongly encourage is, unless you've had somebody that can do some hands-on training or show you how to do that, I kind of discourage from giving that a try. At the very least, it's going to be very frustrating. At the very most, an improperly fitted or positioned sound post can actually damage the inside of the instrument or produce a crack in the top or the back or something like that. So I went ahead and did a cutaway on this instrument to show you the inside structure of the instrument and just how it's lined up. So the sound post, the primary function of the sound post is to take and translate the energy that's produced by the A and E strings on the violin down through the bridge and then move that throughout the body of the instrument. So the sound post also helps to support the top, but that's not its primary function. There's a lot of tonal adjustment that can be done by moving the sound post either closer to the center line of the instrument or a little bit out, and also with the tightness and tension. The sound post is just inside the instrument as a friction fit. It is not glued or secured in any way. It's generally just behind the center of the foot and about half the distance behind it. I don't know if you can see that very well of where that is positioned, and in most cases, there's a very minute amount of adjustment of where that's fitted inside. So a lot of tonal adjustment can be done by moving the sound post in or out as far as the treble response of the strings. So very common on a well-graduated, symphony level instrument for when you release the string tension and take the bridge down for the sound post to fall. Not uncommon. What I would always encourage with that is, if you do have an instrument that the sound post has fallen, please loosen up that string tension. Without that sound post in that partial supporting role, that downward pressure of the bridge can do pretty significant damage to the top pretty quickly. Not as much an issue on violin, but when we get into cellos and basses, it can be pretty catastrophic when we see an instrument that's been years with the sound post down and pressing on the top. On the other side, and this is just informational, you'll see this long bar that extends down the length of the inside. That's the bass bar. So in most cases, this is a secondary piece of wood that is carved and fitted and glued to the top. The role of the bass bar is to take the frequencies from the G and the D string that are transferred through the bridge, send those out across the top of the instrument. So simple way to think of the top of an instrument is kind of like a cone in a speaker, where it's generated around the sides, comes out in the center. Couple things to look for with a bass bar, not something you'd be able to correct on your own, but a couple things to be aware of. If you see some dishing in the top where there's an indentation or where the top is sunk and fallen, that's a telltale sign that a portion of that has come loose. Please, again, loosen the string tension, take the bridge down. That's going to be something that needs to come into a shop. So sometimes can be a pretty significant repair in the amount of disassembly we have to do. The other thing that you may notice that's a telltale sign of a bass bar that's come loose is a kind of vibrating or slapping sound from when the top is moving and the bass bar is not making full contact. So not really a serviceable part, but just something to be aware of with the inside structure. And again, the sound post is just a friction fit inside of there. So just last things on the bridge and the sound post. Please, in any instance, if you're not comfortable with standing it back up, get it to your local shop. We'll be glad to take care of that for you. Something else to look at if it falls down, you want to see if there's any kind of cracks or any kind of things like that. We haven't had very good luck with gluing them back together, but I see that done sometimes. But in most instances, we're going to have to replace that. But again, a couple things really to help prolong the life of the bridge is to make sure you're setting it back into position after tuning it. And also with the life of the instrument is, if the sound post does fall down, please loosen that string tension, get that to a shop, and we can get that taken care of. I'm going to continue to go down just from string length of the instrument onto the tailpiece and fine tuners. Fine tuners are something that we see a lot of instruments come in the shop with simple problems that can be remedied in the classroom. So all fine tuners operate typically just under a couple principles. So one is a lever type fine tuner. So this is just one that's been taken off of the tailpiece. This tailpiece here has them built in, which you'll see very common on a lot of production instruments these days. Maybe older instruments where these will be attached individually to an ebony tailpiece. They all operate on the same principle. So you've got the tensioning screw here. You have a collar that holds the fine tuner to the tailpiece. The tailpiece would pass between that. And as this tensioning screw is tightened, that pulls on that lever. That's what lengthens the string, increases the pitch. So very simple mechanism. Couple things for these in terms of maintenance is just to make sure these collars are tight. So they will periodically work their way loose, either through vibration or changes in humidity again. So, don't need to be over tightened with pliers or anything like that. Usually just a good snug finger tight is just plenty. So, and the other thing is periodically back these off so that you're loosening. You want them to have just enough tension that they're making contact so they won't move freely and rattle. But back these off periodically, readjust the pegs to do most of your tuning. And as the name implies, do these as the fine tuning portion. So this is called a stable model. It has a square post with a string slot in it. This is a post model that has a rounded post, still the same premise with a lever. And with that, there will be some of these that have wider slots that can accommodate either dominant style pearl encore strings, things like that, to accommodate that. So, but all of them operate on the same principle. The other type of fine tuner you may see, usually you'll encounter this on smaller fractional size instruments. So in a lot of cases, and I say that from quarter size and under, where there isn't necessarily enough room between the top and where the tailpiece falls on the instrument to have that kind of clearance, will be this on the string fine tuner. This mounts on top of the string and slides through like that. On a conventional tailpiece, it would slide up against the fret that sits across there. Very important for that to be positioned so that it doesn't spin around. Couple important points with these is I do not recommend these for use on either like dominant or heliocore strings, things like that have a softer core and have a softer wrap. The screw that's inside of this mechanism that impacts and puts downward pressure on that string to pull it sharp can sometimes cut through the wrap on those. Just kind of a cautionary thing with that. On steel strings, steel core strings, these work fine. They're very effective. And on a lot of fractional instruments, it's honestly probably your only choice because you don't have the clearance to the top. Moving down the tailpiece at the very end. So on violin and viola, typically you're just going to see a fixed end pin like this. Not anything really to service, just something to periodically check. You want to make sure that it's seated fully into the spot. On a new instrument, it's very common to see this set out, maybe in some cases 1/16 of an inch. So reason for that, over time, the end pin itself is made out of ebony, which is a very hard, dense wood. Sometimes they're rosewood. The block and the ribs here we have are spruce. That's a much softer wood. So over time, that compression is going to lead for this end pin to want to go fit further in there. So that's why you'll see on a new instrument, they may stick out just a little bit. That's done deliberately for longevity over the instrument. So all of the string tension is pulling from this single point and terminating at the peg. So there's a lot that's done by that end pin. Not much to be serviced, but there's something to be aware of. What you may notice on an instrument that's had significant wear is the hole that this is proportioned in. This is the same taper that we have with the tuning pegs. Over time and tension, that hole may turn more into an oval shape. That's where you would want to have it into a shop where we can retrue that back up and go ahead and fit a larger end pin into that. So something to be mindful of if you see this sort to pull at a can of an angle towards the top of the instrument. That's kind of a telltale sign you need to have some service with that. Couple mechanisms that you will see on both cello and bass. So I have three different options here. This is a piece of this one, and this is a different approach. So all of these do basically the same thing. A couple things to look at with these. So the end pin tensioning screw. So we get a lot of requests for these in the shops. This one's a little more ornamental, polished brass with the larger button on it. In a pinch, most good hardware stores are going to have a thumb screw or a button that's going to be very similar to this. They'll also have a thread checker that you can use to count the turns and the pitch of this thread. So if that's something you wanted to obtain privately, you can do that. We also have a variety of them available through our shops as well. But in most cases, they're very similar to something that you could get in a hardware store. One of the things that we see with this type of mechanism that comes into our shops a lot is the way this works is the screw threads into this collar, and as it passes through the wood collar that goes into the end pin, into the end block of the instrument. As it passes through that hole and the screw goes in, that's what puts the pressure against the end pin rod itself. What we will see happen in a lot of instances with end pins that don't hold or are not keeping tension is at some point this collar's gotten loose, it was repositioned, and the hole in the collar is not lined up with where that screw is impacting. So that's a simple fix that you can kind of look at in the classroom. Back the screw out, just kind of turn the collar around until you're going to see where that passes through. And then just reinsert the screw. So you can do it without taking the collar off like I did here. But you want to make sure that it's passing through to the inside. And these can get turned 180 degrees so that they don't line up, just like that one did. So but hopefully you can see with the inside of that, as I tighten that up, you can see the tip of the screw starting to make it to the inside. That's what's going to position against the end pin and hold it in place. Another kind of mechanism that you may encounter, this is set inside of the socket to an inset, operates under the same principle, but this collar, when this is tightened down, this collar pulls against the end pin. So not really as many user serviceable parts with these. What I do caution with these is periodically, if you can, check for this washer, check that this doesn't get backed all the way out. These are a little more problematic to come by in some instances and may facilitate us having to replace the end pin assembly. So just something periodically to take a look at. But again, this screw here, a lot of times there's something commercially available, maybe from a hardware store that could get you in a pinch to take care of that if you needed that at short notice. One of the last physical parts of the instrument that we're going to move down to is the chin rest. So I have one here that we've taken off of the instrument. So nearly all chin rests are going to have some kind of a tightening mechanism that has these adjustment holes. So we have a chin rest tool that we use in the shop that's made for that purpose. Not by any means is that a necessity. You can use paper clips. Sometimes paper clips tend to be a little too pliable. The other thing that we use, my dentist knows what I do as an occupation. I get broken dental picks from him, and we use those to tighten those up. Couple cautionary tales with chin rest, just so they're snug to the instrument where they won't move. You can over tighten them, and in some cases cause structural damage to the instrument by crushing the rib or indenting the top and the back. Usually the chin rest will give way first, but that's just kind of a cautionary thing if you do that. One of the other quick fixes that we do come across is sometimes these corks will be lost. So the cork not only provides a little bit of padding, it provides a little bit of grip against the top of the instrument. So if these get lost, the corks that are in the repair kit for the band instruments are a good fit. If you didn't want to sacrifice one of those, a small piece of a fairly wide rubber band is a great fix. So something I see a lot of notes taken at when we present these clinics in person is just a little bit of rubber band under there to help keep that chin rest in place. So as far as chin rest placement, really the only rule of thumb is you just want to be close enough that you're in position, but not so close that you're contacting the tailpiece. So as those strings vibrate and the tailpiece vibrates, that little bit of clearance there, if it's just enough to make intermittent contact, that can make some buzzing. So that's something we see as well. But that's pretty much an overview of the entire instrument, some of the things that you'll encounter. Hopefully got some more information for you about how all of this goes together, some simple fix that you can do and work in the classroom. Last part of our segment that we're going to cover is just a little bit of the nomenclature of the bow. I'm going to show you how to apply the rosin. I'm going to show you how to diagnose a few common issues that you might see. This one is a fiberglass bow, so very widely accepted in the industry. We use these almost exclusively in our rental fleet. Same principles with this that you're going to see with a wood bow, like is what I have in the forefront here. So a couple things you want to look for with the bow as far as wear. Most importantly, whenever you're not using the bow to play, please loosen the tension on it. Doesn't have to be so slack to the point that the screw's going to back itself out, but just enough so that you're seeing, a little bit of play in it. It's going to not only increase the longevity of the hair because it's not constantly being in a stretched state, but also it's going to increase the longevity of the stick in a lot of instances with a wood bow because it tends to want to pull this camber or this natural curve out of the bow and straighten it out over time. So most important thing always, and you'll see a lot of stickers and cases and things, always loosen your bow. So the bow hair, just like the wood that's in the instrument, is susceptible to humidity. So in the wintertime, it's very common to see the bow want to act like it's been haired a little bit short. You'll see tension on the hair. A lot of times that will solve itself in the summertime. So when we rehair bows in the shop, depending on what time of year we do them in, we gauge a little bit of that length that we put in the hair. And I'll show you in a second how this comes apart and how we gauge that. So the mechanism down here at the end of the bow, we've got the frog, we have the ferrule, which holds the hair in position on the frog. Underneath the frog, we have the wedge, and I'll show you that in a second. And then the slide on the top, which just covers that internal mechanism. The bow screw is what puts tension on the frog or loosens it up. So this just backs completely out. And then when we remove the frog, this is the eyelet that the screw threads into, puts tension, and pulls back into this mortise inside. So when we rehair and do a new rehair, we try to get towards the front of the mortise, so that way you've got the most longevity and life out of that hair as it wears and stretches over the use of the bow. So our guideline that we use for when a bow needs to be rehaired is if we're holding it static like that, if this eyelet is past the halfway point, and there may be variances from bow to bow in relationship to the thumb grip, if this eyelet is past the halfway point, that's when we designate that we're going to rehair it. So prior to that, there's still enough fluctuation that you're going to be able to get tension on the hair and not run into it being too tight or too loose, depending on the season. But that's kind of the midway point. So that's something you can use as kind of a simple diagnosis. Something that you want to try to be mindful of if you take these apart is, as you can see here, I just lifted it right up and just turned it 90 degrees and I have it pinched here. Be careful about spinning it around. It's very easy for this to get twisted, or in some cases the hair to get looped inside of itself. That's going to be something where we'd have to do a rehair as well. Not really a lot of user serviceable parts in here, but just wanted to show you some of the nomenclature. There you can get a little closer look at the wedge that fits underneath. So that can be replaced, reset inside of that, but that holds the hair across the width of the ferrule and wedges it in place with that. So we'll go ahead and put that back together. So I also have a wood bow. Here's an example. So exact same mechanism, but a couple of additions. So what you're typically are going to see secondarily on a wood bow is a tip facing that has been applied. So in a lot of cases, this will be either plastic or in some cases bone. Maybe if we go back 150 years, maybe in some cases even ivory. We don't use that anymore. This facing is applied over the top of the bow into that mortise. So it can be reapplied if it's not cracked and be reglued. If it is cracked, it has to be replaced. One of the things that is a necessity for us when we replace a tip facing is that we do have to do a rehear. So we in nearly every case, you can't reuse and reposition the hair. So that's just something that has to be done with that. Down at this end of the bow, this is a little different thumb grip configuration where we've got a leather grip that's applied over a wire wrap. Not really anything to service here, but just kind of be aware of that. And then, of course, all the mechanism here is all the same. Difference being on the fiberglass bow, that was a frog that was made out of a plastic composite. This is ebony, got a little extra ornamentation with the ring and the Parisian eye. And then you've got a pearl slide and a weight on the back. So, but again, most important thing, loosen the tension when it's not in use. So, and just be mindful of that amount of stretch and humidity with that. So if the hair gets dirty, what you can use to clean it, we recommend Ivory soap because it's very clean. It doesn't have a lot of perfumes or additives in it. You know, some simple soap and water. You can just use your fingers, don't need to use a brush, anything like that, along the whole length, and then rinse that out and allow it to dry. Something to be careful about with a lot of water in some instances. On some bows, you're going to have a water-soluble finish. So if you do get it wet, you're going to see big water spots and things apprised on that. So that's something to be very careful of in mind. It's not going to happen every time, but it happens enough that it's worth mentioning. So after it's rinsed out, just simply allow it to dry. So that'll help you get a little bit of extra life out of the bow. So the last thing that I'm going to show you is how to apply the rosin. So this is just a simple cake of, just mini rosin that we have. This one has already been scuffed up and used. If it's new and you get it out of the package, it's going to have a shiny surface to it. What we recommend always to be able to get the rosin started to get up into powder is if you've got a piece of sandpaper, emery cloth, nail filers, all those kind of things work really well. You just want to scuff and score that surface just so you can get that to start making a little bit of powder. So that's going to be important to get that started because that's what we want to have to be able to apply that to the length of the bow. So to apply the rosin, go ahead and put a little bit of tension on the screw. We got a little tension there. We're just going to start at one end and just work all the way along the length and just slowly working back and forth. A little bit of pressure, moderate pressure, and just get that loaded in. You can't overdo it, but it's hard to underdo it. So we get a lot of calls each year at the beginning of rental season. We just got our instrument and we pulled the bow out of the case and the fiddle doesn't work. So rosin's usually the answer. So, but simple procedure. If the rosin builds up a little bit too much, a simple tap to the side, the excess dust will just fly off. Something I do caution against is handling the hair too much with your bare fingers. So there's just enough oil and stuff in our skin that can build up into that hair and counteract what the rosin's trying to do. But again, most important thing, when you're not using it, go ahead and loosen it up. So last portion of the clinic, and just something I always go over, is some simple structural things to kind of notice and be aware of. Not stuff to be fixed, but things to be aware of and how to keep small issues from becoming much larger issues. So all of the parts of any string instrument have to be designed and affixed in harmony to be able to work efficiently. So the paradox of any string instrument is it needs to be built heavy enough to support the tension of the strings, but it needs to be built light enough to be able to vibrate. So if you ever get a chance to handle a really high-end symphony instrument, the higher the end the instrument, the lighter they get, because the luthier has figured out all of those points of where they can remove wood and still keep that structural integrity. So the top and the back are fixed to the ribs. So anytime you see anything start to come loose in any of these seams, and these are affixed with a liquid hide glue, so they are designed to be taken apart. So there are some parts on the instrument that are not, but it's very common for these seams to come open. Very easy to repair. Couple big things, easy to recognize. is not only some visual cues with separation, but also you may hear some rattling when the top and the back are vibrating against the ribs what's being played. That's a telltale sign that you have an open seam. So best thing with any kind of structural issue, anything that you notice, please get it in a shop as soon as you can. Those issues are only going to get worse on their own. So, and with continuing to support the string tension and losing that structural integrity of the instrument, you're promoting the chance for damage. So same way with the fingerboard coming loose, or as we mentioned, with the sound post coming down at the top. Things always to be mindful of. Anytime you see something on your instrument that has appreciably changed in terms of string height or response or sound or anything like that are telltale signs that something's changed or moved in the instrument, and we recommend sending it into the shop. I want to thank you for watching today. Hopefully you've had something you can take away from the clinic that you can use in the classroom. If you had any more questions, please feel free to reach out to your local ed rep or your local repair shop. We'll be glad to help.